Well, happy feast, brothers. And thank you for that introduction, Canute. This, if your Feast of Unleavened Bread was anything like ours, this thing went by just at the snap of a finger. Ann and I were talking about it yesterday, and where is all the time going? It's going by so quickly because we're so busy right now. But anyway, we're here today, and I'm going to talk about the Feast of Unleavened Bread. As a matter of fact, I'm going to talk about Hezekiah's Passover, which is the name of the message, and his unleavened bread. I'm going to paraphrase some of these verses rather than physically read them, because I think it adds to the story flow a little bit better. I'm going to start out to begin with, not with Hezekiah, but with his father, because his father was a terrible example. He was a very dysfunctional person. You can see that in the leadership that he put out. There really wasn't any. But he's very dysfunctional. And Hezekiah, on the other hand, was just the opposite. Hezekiah came from a very dysfunctional family, and we'll see that here in chapter 28 of 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles 28 and verse 1. Hezekiah was 20 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 16 years, but not like King David. He didn't reign like King David. He made idols and he burned incense. Verse 4, Ahaz worshipped on high places, on hilltops, under trees and groves and so on. Any place there was an idol, that's where you'd find Hezekiah's father. Verse 5, here's the first war, and God turns his back on Ahaz, and the Armenians just beat him badly. Verse 6, here's the second war. King Pekah of northern Israel, of the 10 tribes, one of his blood relatives, beats him badly, even worse than the first war. They take and kill 120,000 of his warriors. 120,000. Not only that, they take 200,000 women, sons and daughters, to go along with that. So they took them as POWs and went up to Samaria. Well, this is the only bright spot in Ahaz's entire career, and it isn't even his doing. Obed, the prophet of God up there in Samaria, says, let's release all of these POWs, return them back. Give back the gold, the silver, the booty, and cattle, and so on. And to turn them back to Judah, or God could well expand his wrath from Ahaz to include all of northern Israel and defeat us as well. And as unlikely as it seems, that's just what happened. They returned everybody. Verse 17, we see the third war. Here comes Edom, and they take a lot of prisoners. Verse 18, what happens now? You guessed it, war number 4, the fourth war. Here come the Philistines, and they capture several cities and several towns in western Judah. Verse 19, no, this is not about war. This is God humbling Ahaz and his fellow countrymen. First verse I'm going to read is in 2 Chronicles 28 and verse 20. 2 Chronicles 28 and verse 20. Here Ahaz tries to bribe the king of Assyria, and it backfires on him. Verse 20 says, the king of Assyria came to him, but gave him trouble instead of help. Ahaz took some of the things from the temple of the Eternal, and from the royal palace, and from the princes, and presented them to the king of Assyria. But that did not help him. See, it backfires. It was a bribe and it didn't work. Verse 22, we say that Ahaz grows even worse. He's a poor example for his son Hezekiah in every way. In verse 23, we're going to look at an example, I'm going to read this, of the warped thinking of King Ahaz, Hezekiah's father. Verse 23, it says, he offered sacrifices to the gods of Damascus who defeated him. Defeat him, and he's out there offering sacrifices because he thought, since the gods of the kings of the Armenians have helped them, I'll sacrifice to them so they'll help me. Not just thinking in this. But instead, they were his downfall and the downfall of all of Israel. Ahaz in verse 24 stops the true worship of God, and it sounds like today all over again. Ahaz gathered together the furnishings of the temple of God and took them away. He shut the doors of the Eternal's temple and set up altars in every street corner in Jerusalem. What a terrible example he was as a leader. He didn't put God in his life at all, put God completely out of his life, and it was the ruination of not only him but his nation. I say the worst point for last because there's very little talking about it, so I'm going to ad-lib just a bit here. This is the last point. This is the worst and the lowest that he could possibly become. Well, in the palace this morning, there was screaming and yelling and crying. There's women over there that are screaming and yelling, so Hezekiah runs upstairs to his mother's apartment, thinking that it's the maids and the servants are having a bad time, giving one another problems. Well, he gets up there, and the servants are there, the maids are there, the royal guard is there, his dad and mom are there, and his mother is the one that's screaming at the top of her voice. She's screaming and screaming, no, 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 stop, stop, stop. His father's standing there and holding his brother. His mom is lying on the floor, holding on for dear life to Ahaz's foot. And he's standing there kicking and kicking and kicking her to let go. She got a bloody nose, she got a tooth broken out, and she won't let go. Hezekiah is saying, Mom, what's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? Tell me, what's wrong? What's going on? And she's hollering, stop, stop. He says, Dad, what's going on? What is this? And his mother says, Hezekiah, Hezekiah, your father wants to take my son down to the valley and burn him to death as a human sacrifice. Chapter 28 and verse 3 reads, Ahaz burned sacrifices in the valley of Hinnom and sacrificed his sons. His sons, that's more than one. Sacrificed his sons in the fire because he so desperately wanted help from all these metal objects that he thought could help him. Verse 27, Ahaz dies and he's reigned 16 years, and now it's Hezekiah's turn to take over. And he's had a poor example of everything. Hezekiah begins to reign a war-torn country, torn up by wars we've seen badly. And it's also, spiritually dead. He's 25 years old when he begins to reign, and he reigns for 29 years in Jerusalem, and he's a fantastic king. He follows in David's footsteps, his forefather. There's one note about this that's unusual to me, because Hezekiah could not even go to church services because his father had nailed shut the doors on Solomon's temple. He couldn't even go to services. So I believe that Hezekiah had contact with Isaiah the prophet, who inspired him to follow the great God Almighty. What do you suppose Hezekiah's first order of business was? Was it to make treaties so they got stopped getting stopped invasions? No, that wasn't it. Well, maybe it was to call for more taxes, number 2. That wasn't it either. Number 3, to build up the army because it had been badly depleted. That wasn't it either. Maybe it was number 4, to fortify the torn cities, the walls of the cities that were knocked down. Wasn't any of those 4 things. It's not what we would usually think of a government leader. The first order is to restore spiritual health. Restore spiritual health to the nation of Judah. That's the number 1 issue. There's nothing above it. Go to chapter 29 and verse 10. We see that. 2 Chronicles 29 and verse 10. Hezekiah is speaking here, and he says, I intend to make a covenant with the Eternal. the God of Israel, so that his fierce anger will turn away from us. Verse 5, here's the first order given. This takes place on the first day of the first month, the month of Nisan, which happened just a few days ago. Listen to me, Levites. Consecrate yourselves now, and consecrate the temple of the Eternal, the God of your fathers, now. Remove all defilement from the sanctuary. And he wants to begin work immediately. In verse 17, we find the work was hard and tedious. It's taxing. And the work was finally completed in 16 days. However, the problem now is that it's 2 days after the Passover. They've missed the Passover by 2 days, because the 14th of Nisan is the Passover. So the Passover's gone by. While true worship begins in verse 20 here, for the first time in probably 20 years after his father began to reign. Verse 20 says, early the next morning, after the cleanup was done, King Hezekiah gathered the city officials together to went up to the temple of the Eternal. I don't know what early means, but Hezekiah wanted to get back to worshiping immediately. Verse 35 and 36, here's the results of that first day of worship. Verse 35 says, there were burnt offerings in abundance, together with the fat of the fellowship offerings and the drink offerings that accompanied the burnt offerings. So the service of the temple of the Eternal was reestablished. Hezekiah and all the people rejoiced at what God had brought about for his people, because it was done so quickly. Can't help but think about what Solomon says in Ecclesiastes 9 and verse 10. Whatever your hands find to do, do it with all of your might. And he had 100% of his energy put into this. King Hezekiah did. Well, what about the Passover? The Passover's passed. They can't do anything about it, or can they? Next chapter, 2 Chronicles 30 and verse 2. Here's what's going on now. Plan B swings into effect, and here it is. The king and all his officials and the whole assembly in Jerusalem decided to celebrate the Passover in the second month. The second month they decided to celebrate the Passover. Chapter 30 and verse 6. Hezekiah decided to invite all of Israel, the northern 10 tribes, to join in the Passover service down in Jerusalem, because it hadn't been done for so long. Well, of course, northern Israel is going to be happy as can be over that, because they hadn't celebrated either. But the problem is, it's the opposite happens. These writers were laughed to scorn. All these couriers that were sent out, they were laughed at. These people weren't coming to the feast, at least not very many of them. Verse 18 of chapter 30. Not everything is done right here according to God's law, as we'll see in a moment. Although most of the people who came from Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, and Zebulun had not purified themselves, yet they ate the Passover, contrary to what was written. But Hezekiah prayed for them, saying, may the Eternal, who is good, pardon everyone who sets his heart on seeking God, the Eternal, the God of his fathers, even if he is not clean according to the law of the sanctuary. The Eternal heard Hezekiah's prayer and healed the people. Verse 21, what a fantastic feast of unleavened bread we see here. The Israelites who were present in Jerusalem celebrated the Feast of Unleavened Bread for 7 days with great rejoicing. And the Levites and priests sang to the Eternal every day, accompanied by the Eternal's instruments of praise. What a wonderful feast they all had. So now after 7 days, the feast is over, and it's time to go home. Or is it? The feast is not over yet by any means in verse 23. The whole assembly then agreed to celebrate the festival 7 more days. So for another 7 days they celebrated joyfully. King Hezekiah of Judah provided 1,000 bulls, and so on. Verse 26. 2 Chronicles 30, verse 26. There was great joy in Jerusalem, for since the days of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, there had been nothing like this in Jerusalem. The priests and the Levites stood to bless the people, and God heard them, for their prayer reached heaven, his holy dwelling place. How good and how pleasant, Psalms 133, it is for God's people to dwell in unity. But even after 14 days, it's not over. It's not over after 14 days. The Spirit of God is still at work. And we can see that as the people depart. Chapter 31, verse 1. When all this had ended, the Israelites who were there, went out of the towns of Judah. They smashed the sacred stones. This is Ahab stuff. Ahaz stuff. They cut down the Asherah poles. They were wooden, so they had to burn them after that. They destroyed the high places and the altars throughout Judah. Now this is the northern 10 tribes, the people that came from there, doing it down in Judah, in a different country. They did all that in Judah. They did it also in Benjamin. Then as they were going home, they did the same thing in Ephraim. They smashed the sacred poles. They cut down the Ashtaroth poles. They destroyed the high places and so on. After they had destroyed them all, the Israelites returned to their homes and their own property. In verse 6, tithing is restored. Huge piles of things were brought for the priests in abundance. To show you the difference between Hezekiah and Ahaz, I've included this in here because it's talking about his great wealth and the blessings that God has given him. Chapter 32 and verse 27. Chapter 32 and verse 27. Hezekiah had very great riches and honor, and he made treasuries for his silver and gold, and for his precious stones, spices, shields, that means military equipment, and all kinds of valuables. He also made buildings to store the harvest of grain, the new wine, the oil. He made stalls for various kinds of cattle, and pens for all of his flocks. He built villages and acquired great numbers of flocks and herds, for God had given him very, very great riches. In verse 30, there was one building project that he did, and you can see why after you read a little bit of this. Jerusalem had no self-sustaining water supply. Even during the times of King David and King Solomon, there was no water inside of Jerusalem. It all had to be brought in. So if there was a long siege against Jerusalem, the city was doomed because they didn't have any water to drink. So they were really in dire straits. So here's what Hezekiah does. It was Hezekiah who blocked up the upper outlet of the Gihon spring and channeled the water down the west side of the city of David. There were walls all around Jerusalem, but the water supply was outside of the walls. It's a terrible fix to be in, and it had been that way for centuries. Well, what Hezekiah did, he'd hammered a 1,700-foot long tunnel, brought water into the city. So the tunnel went under the wall, and it went over a quarter of a mile. It was chiseled out of solid rock, just like you're going to chisel this concrete here. That's what it was like. And it went for over a quarter of a mile. And in one place, it's 60 foot deep. God is with Hezekiah because Hezekiah pleases God. And God rewards him for it. He obeys God. Let's go to 2 Kings 18. 2 Kings 18. This is another Syrian king who comes to him, just like another one came to Ahaz, his father. I'm going to read this. 2 Kings 18, verse 13. In the 14th year of Hezekiah's reign, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. This king of Assyria is no small nuisance. He's a troublemaker and a big one, and he can back it up. Just as we've already read, he took over quite a number of cities down in Judah that Hezekiah had fortified. So in verse 14, we see Hezekiah admits his error, and he repents of it, and he says, I've done wrong, and he seeks peace. But the problem is, he seeks peace through bribery. Just like his father did, and this doesn't work for him either. 2 Kings 18 and verse 14. So Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent this message to the king of Assyria. I've done wrong. Withdraw from me, and I'll pay you whatever you demand of me. The king of Assyria exacted from Hezekiah 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. Now, in our time, what that means is that he gave up 11 tons of pure silver, and he gave up a ton of pure gold. We're talking about immense amount of booty that he gave up. But this failed him too. Hezekiah tries the same thing, and it fails. Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the temple, verse 15, and of the treasuries of the royal palace. Well, in 8 verses from verse 17 through 25, the Assyrian king rejected this bribe. He couldn't be bought off even with 11 tons of silver. What was he seeking? What did this king want? He wanted absolute power. He wanted absolute authority. Give up or die. Surrender or die. That's what he was about. He wasn't there to gather gold. He wasn't there to gather silver. He wanted his thumb to rule everybody his way. That's what he was after. Unfortunately, Hezekiah didn't learn that from his father. He failed to learn it. Well, having failed, Hezekiah now goes to God's temple. Now he's on the right track and pours out his heart. He pours his heart out to God. From there, he goes to the prophet Isaiah. Very interesting what happens next. 2 Kings 19 and verse 32. 2 Kings 19 and verse 32. This is God's word through the mouth of Isaiah the prophet. Verse 32 says, this is what the Eternal says concerning the king of Assyria. He will not enter this city. He will not shoot an arrow here. He will not come before it with shield. He will not come to put a siege ramp against it. Verse 34 says, I will defend this city and save it, for my sake and for the sake of David, my servant. Not even shoot an arrow? Not one arrow? There's thousands and thousands of warriors out there, and they're not even going to shoot one arrow? Not one arrow? They're all over the place out there. How in the world can that be? Well, early the next morning, the Assyrian camp is calm. It's quiet. There's no campfires burning. There's no smoke out there. No one's eating breakfast. It's early in the morning. No breakfast. There's no trumpets blowing. There's no chariots running around, no horses. There's no building about. There's nothing. All is quiet on the home front. Verse 35 explains why there was not one arrow shot. Verse 35 says, that night the angel of the eternal, this is the death angel that went through Egypt on the night of the Passover. The angel of the eternal went out and put to death 185,000 men in the Assyrian camp. When the people of Judah got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies. Brethren, some of us have grown up in dysfunctional families where mom and dad don't always get along. But we don't have to follow in their footsteps. We don't have to do the things that are defeating our parents. We've seen an example of a family that was very dysfunctional, was not up to speed, and yet from it came one of the greatest kings in Israel. If our parents don't have a lot of ambition, that doesn't mean that we have to follow that way. If one of our parents is an alcoholic, it doesn't mean that we have to go that way. We can better ourselves. We can be much better than that. And God says so. The last scripture that I have, I'm not going to read it, I'm just going to quote it. It's in Deuteronomy 30. And it applies to this, and it applies to all of us here today. I've set before you this day life and death. Therefore, choose life. We can see a great example of that in Hezekiah and his father. There's a vast difference between the two of the people. Brethren, finish the feast on a great note.